Genesis 11 verse 6. God looks down at the earth and says a phrase that should make any reader stop and reread. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. It wasn't a compliment, it was a diagnosis. Something was happening in that plain that concerned the creator of the universe himself. And it wasn't the height of the tower. Most people imagine Babel as an act of architectural arrogance, a bunch of proud builders trying to reach heaven with bricks. God gets offended, comes down, confuses the languages, and that's it. Simple story. Clear moral lesson. Don't be proud. But that superficial reading hides something far more disturbing. Because when you examine the original Hebrew text, when you understand the historical context, when you analyze what was really happening in that plain, you discover that the tower was merely the visible symptom of something that threatened God's very plan for humanity. And it all started with mud. The plain of Shinar lay between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. It was a fertile region, abundant in water, perfect for agriculture. The rivers overflowed annually, depositing layers of nutrient-rich sediment that transformed the region into the cradle of civilization. Wheat, barley, dates, legumes, everything grew abundantly in that soil, blessed by regular floods. But there was a critical problem for any civilization that wanted to build something permanent. There was no stone, no nearby mountains, no accessible quarries, just kilometers upon kilometers of alluvial terrain, soft mud that the floods deposited every year. The same water that fertilized the soil also ensured that the subsoil was unstable, soft, unsuitable for heavy foundations. Entire civilizations died for less. Without stone, there are no walls. Without walls, there is no protection. Without protection, there is no permanent city. That was the unforgiving logic of the ancient world. Stone meant permanence, mud meant temporary, and temporary meant vulnerable. The Egyptians had limestone and granite in abundance. The Hittites had basalt. The Phoenicians had marine limestone. Every great civilization of antiquity established itself where there was stone to build. It was a basic rule of survival. But the descendants of Noah, settled in that muddy plain, discovered something revolutionary. Something that would completely change the rules of the game. If you take mud, mold it into a rectangular shape, let it dry in the sun for a few days, and then burn it in a kiln at temperatures above 900 degrees, it transforms. The soft clay, which would dissolve in the first rain, becomes hard ceramic. Mud becomes artificial stone, and unlike natural stone, which needs to be cut in distant quarries, transported for kilometers and fitted by specialized craftsmen, brick can be mass-produced right at the construction site, with literally infinite raw material. Genesis 11 verse 3 records this moment with impressive technical precision. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Brick instead of stone. The phrase seems simple, but it hides a complete technological revolution. They didn't just substitute one material for another. They discovered they could manufacture their own building material. They no longer depended on geography. They no longer needed mountains. The natural limitation had been overcome by human ingenuity, and the bitumen mentioned in the text was natural asphalt, a black, viscous substance that seeped from the ground in various regions of Mesopotamia. Bitumen pits existed in abundance near Hit, on the Euphrates, just a few days' journey from the plain of Shinar. When heated, the bitumen became liquid and penetrated the cracks between bricks. When it cooled, it solidified and created a practically impermeable seal. Combined with fired bricks, bitumen created structures that resisted floods, earthquakes, and centuries of erosion. Archaeologists have found ruins of Mesopotamian ziggurats built with this technique that have survived more than 4,000 years. Bricks still intact, bitumen still sealing the joints. The technology worked, and when it works, it scales. But before scaling, they needed to master production, and brick production on an industrial scale required a system that few can imagine. The first step was extracting the mud. Workers dug in areas near the rivers, where the sediment was finer and more uniform. They filled wicker baskets with 30 to 40 kilograms of wet clay and carried them on their backs to the processing area. A day's work meant dozens of trips, hundreds of kilograms transported by a single man. Raw mud wasn't suitable for bricks. It needed to be prepared. Workers trampled the clay mixed with water, cut straw, and sometimes animal dung. The straw functioned as structural reinforcement, preventing the brick from cracking during drying. The dung added organic fibers that improved cohesion. The mixture needed to reach a specific consistency, neither too liquid nor too dry. This preparation work was done mainly with the feet. Men entered shallow tanks full of clay and trampled for hours, mixing the ingredients until achieving uniformity. The sun beat down from above. The mud stuck to their legs. Insects accumulated around them. It was exhausting, repetitive, essential work. When the mixture was ready, the molders went into action. They used rectangular wooden molds, usually measuring 30 centimeters long by 15 wide and 10 high. They filled the mold with clay, compacted it with their hands, smoothed the top surface, and turned the mold over onto a flat surface. The raw brick was formed. But a raw brick isn't a brick, it's just molded mud. To become building material, it needed to dry. The bricks were arranged in rows in the sun, spaced to allow air circulation. Depending on humidity and temperature, drying took 3 to 7 days. Bricks dried too quickly cracked. Bricks dried too slowly molded. The process required constant attention. Sun-dried bricks could already be used for simple constructions, common houses, garden walls, temporary structures. But for something permanent, something monumental, the next step was necessary. Firing. The kiln was the heart of the operation. And here the complexity increased dramatically. Building a kiln capable of reaching 900 degrees or more required considerable technical knowledge. The structure needed to retain heat, allow air entry to feed combustion, and have enough internal space to stack hundreds of bricks at a time. Mesopotamian kilns were generally built in a beehive shape, with thick, refractory clay walls that insulated the internal heat. An opening at the base allowed feeding the fire. Another opening at the top allowed smoke to escape. The bricks were stacked internally so that hot air circulated between them, ensuring uniform firing. Feeding the kiln was brutal work. Ordinary fire wasn't enough. They needed controlled temperatures, maintained for 20 to 40 consecutive hours, sometimes more. This required constant fuel. In Mesopotamia, without extensive forests, the main fuel was wheat straw, dried barley stalks, ox and sheep dung, carefully collected and dried. Workers operated in shifts, feeding the flames without stopping. The surrounding air was unbreathable. Dense smoke, loaded with carbon particles, invaded the lungs. Heat radiated in waves that burned skin from meters away. Getting too close meant burns. Getting too far meant letting the fire die. The temperature needed to rise gradually. Heating too fast cracked the bricks. Cooling too fast did too. Master kiln operators developed almost instinctive sensitivity for the process, observing the color of the flames, feeling the heat on their faces, adjusting fuel feeding based on decades of accumulated experience. When the kiln finally cooled, days after being extinguished, the workers opened it and removed the fired bricks. The transformation was visible. What entered as gray-yellow mud came out as red-orange ceramic, hard, resistant, almost indestructible. Brick instead of stone. But the scale of the Babel project required something far beyond an occasionally operating kiln. Try to grasp the operation necessary to erect a tower visible from kilometers away. Estimates based on known ziggurats, like the Etemenanki of Babylon, rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar, suggest that a structure of that size would require between 30 and 50 million bricks, millions, and each one passing through human hands multiple times. To produce 50 million bricks, even working intensively for a decade, you would need hundreds of kilns operating simultaneously, thousands of workers in clay extraction, thousands in mixture preparation, thousands in molding, thousands in transport for drying, thousands feeding the kilns, thousands removing and transporting the final product. It was an industrial operation on a scale the world wouldn't see again for millennia, and that was just material production. Vertical transport was another logistical nightmare that defies imagination. There were no cranes, there were no elevators, there were no sophisticated pulleys with gear systems. Each brick went up ramps of earth built around the structure, carried on men's backs or in baskets pulled by ropes. The ramps were massive structures in themselves. To maintain a slope gentle enough for loaded men to climb without slipping, the ramp needed to have length proportional to height. A 50-meter tower would require a ramp of at least 200 meters in length, sometimes more. And as the tower grew, the ramp needed to grow with it, constantly modified, extended, reinforced. In some archaeologically documented cases, the volume of earth used in the access ramp exceeded the volume of the structure being built itself. Artificial mountains of compacted earth, temporary, destined to be removed when the work was finished. And there was the problem of accumulated weight. Stacked bricks exert downward pressure. As the tower rose, the base bricks supported ever-increasing loads. If the foundation wasn't perfectly distributed, if the base bricks weren't fired hard enough, if the soil below wasn't adequately prepared, the entire structure would collapse on itself. Modern engineers calculate that a tower 100 meters high, built with fired mud bricks, would require a base of at least 200 meters wide to adequately distribute the weight. It was pure geometry, applied mathematics, structural engineering on a monumental scale. Each level needed to be slightly smaller than the previous one, creating the stepped silhouette characteristic of ziggurats. That shape wasn't merely aesthetic, it was structural. The steps distributed weight laterally, reducing vertical pressure on the lower layers. And there was the bitumen. Liters upon liters of bitumen needed to be transported from extraction pits, heated at the construction site, and applied between brick layers. Hot bitumen burned skin instantly. Workers developed thick calluses on their hands, permanent scars on their arms, respiratory diseases caused by constant inhalation of hydrocarbon vapors. They were doing this over 4,000 years ago, without safety equipment, without unions, without regulated breaks, without hospitals to treat the injured. But the tower wasn't the goal, it was the means. Genesis 11 verse 4 reveals the real motivation behind all this monumental effort. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Three crucial elements in that phrase. First, they wanted a city. Second, they wanted a tower. Third, they wanted to make a name for themselves. And all of this to avoid being scattered. The fear of dispersion dominated that generation, and it had deep historical reason for this. Just a few generations before, the flood had eliminated all of humanity except 8 people. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives emerged from the ark into a completely empty world. No neighbors, no cities, no civilization, just traumatized survivors trying to start over from absolute zero. Imagine the psychological impact, an entire year inside a vessel floating on the waters of divine judgment, knowing that all the humanity they knew, cousins, friends, neighbors, had perished, hearing the absolute silence when the waters finally receded, descending onto a planet that seemed like another, devastated, muddy, unrecognizable. God had explicitly commanded in Genesis 9 verse 1, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Fill the earth. The command was clear: spread out, multiply in diversity, occupy the entire planet. Don't stay concentrated in a single place. But the trauma of the flood created an opposite reaction. Fear overcame obedience. If we spread out, we'll be vulnerable. If each family goes in a different direction, we'll lose numerical strength. If we separate, we'll be swallowed by the wild world still recovering from the cataclysm. The only security was in unity, in concentration, in permanence, in a single fortified location. And so, instead of spreading, they concentrated. Instead of multiplying, in geographic diversity, they multiplied in population density. All of post-flood humanity, probably several tens of thousands of people at that point in history, perhaps more, converged on a single fertile plain. The city wasn't just functional housing. It was an existential declaration. Here we stay. From here, we don't leave. Let the world come to us. We won't go to the world. And the tower was the visible symbol of that declaration, a territorial landmark that could be seen from kilometers away, a structure that told any lost traveler, any family considering migration, any group thinking of separating, here is civilization, here is the center, here is power, here is security. Let us make a name for ourselves. That phrase in Hebrew carries weight that the English translation doesn't fully capture. Making a name in ancient Semitic culture meant much more than fame or reputation. It meant establishing permanent identity. It meant ensuring that future generations would remember. It meant conquering a form of immortality through legacy. The name was the essence of the person or people. Without a name, you didn't exist. Being remembered by name meant continuing to exist even after death. It was the human response to mortality. And here is the first serious theological problem. Throughout the biblical narrative, the one who makes names is God. It was God who named Adam. It was God who changed Abram's name to Abraham. It was God who called Israel by name. It was God who would name the Messiah. The act of naming, of defining identity, belongs to the Creator. When humanity decides to make its own name, it's claiming a divine prerogative. It's declaring existential independence. It's saying, we don't need God to define us. We define ourselves. We don't need the identity He wants to give us. We create our own identity. It was ontological autonomy, the original sin repeated on a civilizational scale. But there was something even more dangerous happening in that plane, something that transcended architecture and touched on God's very plan for human history. And here we enter the verse that should send chills down any attentive reader's spine. Genesis 11, verses 5 and 6. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. God came down to see. The expression is anthropomorphic, obviously. The omnipresent God doesn't need to physically descend to observe anything. He sees everything, always, in all places, simultaneously. But the text uses this language of divine movement to communicate something important. The situation was serious enough to merit special attention, personal intervention, direct action, and the divine diagnosis is disturbing. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Think about the magnitude of that statement. The omniscient God who knows the end from the beginning, who sees all future possibilities, who calculates all possible trajectories of human history, looks at that plane and concludes, if this continues, if this trajectory isn't interrupted, humanity will be capable of anything. Anything. The Hebrew word used is yazam, which means to plan, intend, imagine, and yibatza, which means to be prevented, to be restricted. The complete phrase indicates that no human plan would find barriers, no imagination would be limited, no project would be impossible. That should be a good thing, right? Unlimited capacity, unrestricted potential. Humanity finally reaching its maximum development. But the context reveals why it was dangerous. The unlimited capacity was being directed toward a project of absolute autonomy, unity without God, power without divine purpose, civilization as a substitute for the Creator. If they continued on that trajectory, what exactly would they achieve? Not heaven literally. God wasn't worried about the tower's altitude. No human construction, however tall, could literally reach the divine dwelling. The concern was something else. God was concerned about the direction of human civilization. A humanity unified in rebellion would be capable of creating systems of independence so sophisticated that the need for God would completely disappear from collective consciousness. Organized religion replacing personal relationship with the Creator. Technology replacing dependence, human government replacing divine government, self-security replacing trust in providence. And this wasn't theoretical speculation, it was projection based on what was already happening before divine eyes. Look at what they had already achieved in just a few generations after the flood. They had mastered material production, transforming useless mud into artificial stone. They had developed monumental construction techniques that defied the region's very geography. They had created organizational systems capable of coordinating tens of thousands of workers in synchronized tasks. They had established supply logistics on an urban scale that few later empires would match. They kept dozens of kilns operating continuously, day and night. They distributed food to multitudes. They solved engineering problems that modern architects still study with admiration. And all of this in just a few generations after humanity's total restart. The speed of technological and organizational progress was astonishing. Because post-flood humanity had an advantage we rarely consider when reading this story: accumulated knowledge. Noah wasn't just any primitive. He was 600 years old when the flood came, 600 years of experience, observation, learning, and knowledge accumulation, and he lived another 350 years after the flood, totaling 950 years of life. Throughout all that post-flood time, he transmitted everything he knew to his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and subsequent generations. Pre-flood humanity had reached levels of civilization that the biblical text only hints at in brief strokes. Genesis 4 mentions Cain founding cities. It mentions Jabal as the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock, indicating organized animal husbandry. It mentions Jubal as the father of all who play the harp and flute, indicating musical and artistic development. It mentions Tubal-Cain as the forger of all instruments, of bronze and iron, indicating advanced metallurgy. All of this before the flood. Sophisticated civilization, developed technology, knowledge accumulated over generations, and that knowledge wasn't completely lost in the waters. It was preserved in Noah's memory, who lived in that antediluvian world for 6 centuries, and transmitted forward to new generations. Now, with all of humanity concentrated in a single location, speaking a single language without communication barriers, that knowledge was being shared, refined, amplified, and developed without any obstacles. Imagine a global research center where all the world's scientists speak exactly the same language, work on the same campus, share discoveries instantly, collaborate without cultural or linguistic friction. The speed of innovation would be exponential. Discoveries that would take centuries under normal conditions would happen in decades. Developments that would require multiple attempts in isolated cultures would happen on the first coordinated attempt. That was exactly what was happening in the plain of Shinar, the first and only time in history that all of humanity worked together on a single project with perfect communication. And God saw that he needed to intervene, not from fear of divine competition, not from celestial insecurity, not because the tower literally threatened heaven, but out of love for the very project he had for humanity. Because God's plan was never a monolithic civilization, concentrated and dominating the planet from a single center of power. The divine plan from the beginning was diversity, multiplication, distinct nations, occupying distinct lands, developing distinct cultures that would eventually be blessed through a specific nation, Israel, which didn't yet exist at that point in history. Babel was creating a civilizational shortcut that would bypass the entire divine, redemptive plan. A humanity unified in autonomy wouldn't need a Messiah, wouldn't seek external salvation, wouldn't recognize the need for redemption, would have everything it needed in itself, and the signs were already appearing. The tower wasn't just a political monument, it was a religious structure. The Mesopotamian ziggurats that archaeologists excavated were temples, centers of worship. Each level represented a layer of the cosmos in Babylonian cosmology. The top was considered the dwelling of the gods. Priests climbed the steps to approach the divine. A tower that reaches to the heavens wasn't naive architectural hyperbole, it was a deliberate theological statement. They were building an artificial ladder to the transcendent, a manufactured access to the divine, a path to God that didn't depend on God revealing that path. And here is the most disturbing spiritual inversion in the entire narrative. Throughout the biblical record, the pattern is God descending to meet humanity. God descended to walk with Adam in the garden in the cool of the day. God descended to warn Noah about the flood that would come. God would descend to speak with Abraham in the plains of Mamre. God would descend on Mount Sinai in fire and smoke to give the law to Moses. And in the final fulfillment, God would descend in human flesh, dwelling among us. As Emmanuel, the divine movement is always from top to bottom, from God to humanity, from grace to need, from revelation to ignorance. At Babel, humanity decided to invert the direction. They would climb up to God, they would force the encounter, they would build their own path to the transcendent. They wouldn't passively wait for divine initiative. They would take human initiative. They would reach heaven by their own effort. It was religion without revelation, spirituality without submission, transcendence without dependence, salvation without a savior. And it worked. At least it seemed to work. The rituals were elaborate. The priests were respected. The offerings were abundant. The Babylonian religious system that would be born from those roots would become one of the most sophisticated in antiquity, influencing cultures for thousands of years through astrology, divination, magic, and complex pantheons of deities. But it was human construction pointing upward, not divine revelation descending downward. And God, who could have simply ignored the tower and let natural time bring it down, who could have waited for internal conflicts to fragment the artificial unity, chose to intervene directly because the error wasn't in engineering. It was in spiritual direction. Humanity was organizing itself around the wrong center. And the more sophisticated that organization became, the more successful the project was, the harder it would be to reorient the trajectory later. So God acted. And the way he acted reveals as much about his character as about the gravity of the situation. Genesis 11, verse 7. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other. The plural language, let us go down, directly echoes the language of Genesis 1. Let us make mankind in our image. Divine counsel. Trinitarian deliberation. The same authority that created humanity. In the beginning was now intervening to redirect its course in history, and the intervention was surgically precise. God didn't destroy the tower. He didn't send fire from heaven as he would later do with Sodom. He didn't open the earth to swallow the city as he would with Korah. He didn't send plague or pestilence. He didn't kill anyone. He simply did something much more efficient and much less violent. He confused the language. The Hebrew verb balal means to mix, confuse, scramble. The same root that would give the city its name. God scrambled the patterns of human communication. The sounds one person produced no longer corresponded to the meanings another person received. Try to imagine the exact moment this happened. The construction site functioning normally. Thousands of workers in their routine tasks. Supervisors giving orders, carriers transporting bricks, molders preparing the next batch, kiln operators feeding the fire. And then, instantly, chaos. A mason shouts for the carrier to bring more bricks. The carrier looks confused. He doesn't understand a single word. He tries to respond, but what comes out of his mouth are sounds completely strange to the mason. The mason thinks he's being mocked. He gets irritated. He shouts louder. The supervisor appears to resolve the conflict, but he doesn't understand either of them, and neither of them understands the supervisor. Within hours, the most organized construction site in human history became absolute chaos. Groups that understood each other began to isolate themselves. Families that shared the same new dialect instinctively grouped together. The artificial unity that kept the project functioning evaporated instantly. And it wasn't just impossible to continue building, it was impossible to coexist. How do you divide food when you can't negotiate distribution? How do you resolve disputes when you can't argue your case? How do you maintain public order when no one understands the authorities' instructions? How do you plan anything when language that was transparent has become opaque? The natural, inevitable solution was separation. Each linguistic group began to move away, not by additional explicit divine command, but by practical impossibility of staying together. Coexistence became unbearable. Conflict became inevitable. The only possible peace was distance. And so, ironically, exactly what they had feared most from the beginning happened. They were scattered over the face of the whole earth. The tower they built specifically to prevent dispersion became the catalyst for the greatest dispersion in human history. The anti-separation project produced total separation. Genesis 11, verse 9, records the etymology of the name. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth, Babel. The name sounds like Balal in Hebrew, which means to confuse, to mix. Later, Babylonians would interpret the name as Bab-ili, Gate of the Gods. But for the Hebrews, Babel meant confusion. The city's name became synonymous with fragmentation. The monument to human unity became a permanent symbol of division, and the tower remained unfinished, the bricks abandoned, the kilns extinguished, the access ramps slowly crumbling over the centuries as vegetation reclaimed the terrain, the bitumen drying and cracking under the relentless sun. Later, Jewish traditions elaborated on the scene. They describe workers climbing the ramps with bricks, unable to communicate, some falling from heights due to lack of coordination, others simply abandoning the work and leaving without looking back. They describe the partially built ziggurat remaining there for generations as a silent witness to divine judgment. Archaeologists have found ruins of ziggurats throughout Mesopotamia, some clearly unfinished, abandoned at intermediate stages of construction. Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, was rebuilt multiple times over the millennia by different emperors, always trying to reach greater heights, always eventually falling into ruins again. Nebuchadnezzar II, in the 6th century BC, tried to complete what he called the Tower of Ancient Times. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Babylon around 450 BC, described an 8-story structure about 90 meters high. Alexander the Great found ruins and planned to rebuild but died before completing the project. The impulse of Babel never died. It just fragmented into multiple smaller attempts, and each of those attempts carried the same spiritual DNA. Unify humanity under a single power. Build your own path to glory. Make a name that would last forever. Every empire that arose afterward tried in its own way to recreate Babel's lost unity. Akkad under Sargon, the first empire in history, tried to unify Mesopotamia under one language and one ruler. Babylon under Hammurabi and later under Nebuchadnezzar tried the same. Assyria tried even more brutally, deporting entire populations to break regional identities. Persia tried with more sophistication, allowing cultural diversity but demanding absolute political loyalty. To the King of Kings, Greece under Alexander tried through culture, spreading Hellenic language, philosophy and customs across 3 continents. Rome tried with a combination of military force, universal law, and infrastructure that connected the known world. And in each case, the Babylonian pattern repeated itself: forced unification, eventual cultural resistance, inevitable fragmentation, Babel echoing through the millennia in ever larger cycles. Arab empires spread Arabic from Morocco to Indonesia. Mongols created the largest contiguous territorial empire in history. Spaniards and Portuguese exported their languages and religions to newly discovered continents. The British painted a quarter of the world map red. Soviets tried to unify humanity under an ideology. Americans tried to do the same through markets and culture. Each attempt carries the echo of that plane. Let us make a name for ourselves. But there was something happening at Babel that transcends politics and linguistics, something that touches on the deepest questions about human nature and its relationship with the Creator. The confusion of languages wasn't just judgment, it was also protection. Consider what would have happened if Babel had succeeded. A humanity permanently unified under a religious system that excluded the true God. A global civilization where the search for the transcendent was satisfied by human constructions. A world where no one would seek divine revelation because they thought they had already found their own way. There would be no Abraham leaving Ur to follow the voice of an unknown God. There would be no Israel as a separate nation to demonstrate divine covenant. There would be no prophets confronting idolatry because there would be no alternative to the dominant system. There would be no preparation for the coming of the Messiah because no one would feel the need for one. The dispersion created the conditions for the redemptive plan to develop. The fragmentation created space for a specific nation to be called, separated, developed, and used as a channel of blessing for all the other fragmented nations. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed, God would tell Abraham a few generations later. Families in the plural, distinct nations, different languages, separate cultures, all eventually receiving blessing through a specific lineage that only existed because Babel was interrupted. And the language that had been confused in judgment would be restored in grace. Centuries upon centuries passed. The people of Israel were formed, grew, received the law, entered the promised land, sinned, were disciplined, returned, waited. And then in Jerusalem during the Feast of Pentecost, 50 days after Jesus' resurrection, something happened that no builder of Babel could have imagined. The Holy Spirit descended upon the gathered disciples, and when they began to speak, people from all nations who were in Jerusalem heard the message, each in their own native language. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, the regions of Libya, Romans, Cretans, Arabs. all hearing the wonders of God in languages they understood perfectly. Babel separated humanity through the confusion of languages. Pentecost reunited humanity through the gift of tongues. And the fundamental difference between the two events reveals everything about the contrast between human project and divine project. At Babel, unity was artificial, forced, based on fear and pride. Perfect communication served purposes of rebellion. The common project was autonomy from God. At Pentecost, unity was spiritual, voluntary, based on grace and faith. Miraculous communication served purposes of gospel proclamation. The common project was to glorify Christ and spread the message of salvation. Babel wanted to climb up to God by its own effort. Pentecost was God, descending to dwell in his people through the Spirit. Babel wanted to make a human name that would last forever. Pentecost proclaimed the name above every name, Jesus, at which every knee will bow. Babel wanted to prevent dispersion through concentration. Pentecost dispersed the disciples throughout the known world, but maintained spiritual unity through the same Spirit dwelling in each one. The reversal was complete. What judgment divided, grace reunited. But it reunited differently. No longer forced uniformity, but unity in diversity. No longer one mandatory language, but the Spirit translating eternal truths for each culture. The plain of Shinar was left empty. The abandoned bricks turned to dust. The kilns collapsed on themselves. The access ramps were absorbed by the earth from which they came. The builders scattered to the four corners of the earth, carrying languages their own brothers no longer understood. But the impulse that raised Babel never disappeared. Every empire that tried to dominate the world, every ideology that promised to unite humanity under a single banner, every movement that offered collective identity in exchange for absolute loyalty, every project that said, "Let us make a name for ourselves," all carry Babel's DNA. The tower was just the symptom. The disease was something else, the deep conviction rooted in the human heart since the fall in Eden that humanity doesn't need God to reach heaven, that we can build our own ladder, that we can manufacture our own salvation, that we can define our own identity, that we can create our own paradise. 3,000 years later, that conviction continues stacking bricks.